Hey everyone, greetings from Orono. I'm John Diamond. I'm the president and CEO of the University of Maine Alumni Association. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our topic is Maine and offshore wind technology developed by University of Maine researchers and other collaborators. We've got a pretty impressive geographic representation among our virtual attendees today. We have Black Bear alumni and friends from 16 states and the District of Columbia. So pleased to have you here. And it's a big day for this topic in Augusta at the State House. In Augusta, there's a hearing going on about the governor's plans for offshore wind for a 12 tower array out off the coast of Maine, well off the coast of Maine. And our presenter today, I'm sure, will mention the details of that. So we will be starting our session with a presentation by Dr. Habib Dagher, who is the Executive Director of UMaine's Advanced Structures and Composites Centers. Both Dr. Dagher and the center are recognized as world leaders for their cutting-edge research. It would take an hour for me to list all of the honors, the patents, and the grants that he and his colleagues at the center have received, so I won't do that. But that said, you're going to see several examples of their work. We also anticipate being joined by State Representative Genevieve McDonald. Along with her role in the legislature, Representative McDonald.
Yeah, she did get back to me on my emails.
Whoops, somebody, if you could mute your microphone. I think I picked up somebody else there, so excuse me. So let me tell you about Representative McDonald. I mentioned she is a UMaine alumna. She's also the mother of twin girls. She's a lobster boat captain and an advisor to the partnership that's developing Maine Aquaventus, which is the offshore wind power project that will be the focus of today's talk. The presentation will cover roughly 2/3 of today's webinar, and the remainder will be saved for your questions and Dr. Dagher's and Representative McDonald's answers. So if you'd like to submit a question, there's an easy way to do it. If you're familiar with Zoom, you've been probably doing it quite a bit. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little comic strip speech bubble. That's the chat button. If you want to submit a question, just click on that bubble, type in your question, and hit return or enter on your keyboard. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible during the time we have available. And so, we're recording this session, and it will be made available online later, probably in a day or so. We'll send out a notice about to everybody who registered to let them know where they could find the recording of this. So with that, let's get started. I'll turn it over to Dr. Habib Dagher. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and looking forward to the presentation today. I'm going to go ahead and go to full screen. And I'm going to talk about offshore wind today, and particularly floating offshore wind. I'll talk a little bit about the center. Then I'll talk about floating wind turbines. Why here? What do they look like? I'll talk about UMaine research on floating turbines starting about 12 years ago. And then talk about next steps, particularly New England Aquaventus. This is our research center at the University of Maine. I've been a faculty at the University of Maine for 35 years. I'm looking forward for 35 more. Our research center was established 25 years ago, and it's the largest university-based research center in the state of Maine today. We sponsored over 2,500 students financially from 35 majors, and the students come and work in the lab and get paid to do so. If you're an undergrad, you can work up to 30 hours a week and get paid to do that. And of course, if you're grad students, you live in the center. We have today about 260 faculty, staff, and students that work in the lab. It's about 100,000 square feet. We've had a number of spin-off companies in the lab from the research developed in the lab. Over 25,000 visitors have been to the laboratory. These are our partners and clients from across the globe. We have over 500 research partners or clients that work with us. A lot of them send their money to Maine to do research and development in Maine for them. Our goal is to develop new materials for construction that are more environmentally friendly. They have a low environmental footprint, and to focus on developing what we call GEM, our strategic plans called GEM, for green energy and green materials for society. To give you a sense of what it looks like inside our lab, this is an example of our wind blade test facility. And we're testing right here 165-foot long wind blades under fatigue loading to simulate 20 to 25 years of life in a very short period of time in our lab. And notice there's one actuator at the bottom moving it up and down, and it's being fatigued at the resonant frequency of the blade. That's how we could move it so easily with one actuator. This is our wave wind facility. We call it W square wave wind facility. What we do here is we can simulate ocean environments by both simultaneously creating a wave environment as well as a wind environment on top of it. It's the only facility of its kind in the United States. Right below you is a wave basin, and above you is a wind tunnel. It's an open jet wind tunnel. What you see in the foreground is a floating wind turbine being tested at 1/50 scale. So basically shrinking the size to about 1/50th and testing it in this environment to figure out how the bigger units will perform offshore. This is an example of how we test structures that float in the water, whether it's a boat or testing a way to protect cities from extreme storms. But you can see here we can create waves of different heights and different frequencies and different directions. We can make the waves come from different angles. And then on top of that, we create a windstorm. And the wind will change with height, just like it does offshore. So we can change the speed of the wind as you rise above the water. We can change the wind turbulence intensity. So almost recreate, if you wish, an offshore environment in our laboratory to test new technologies that we want to deploy offshore. So if you're ever back in Maine, we'd love to show you that facility. This is a 1/50 scale version of a 6 megawatt floating turbine, and being subjected to almost a 50-year storm right here. To put things in perspective, a 50-year storm has about a 60-foot high waves from peak to trough. Now let's talk about offshore wind. Offshore wind is a technology that the world is embracing in Europe, in the United States, in Southeast Asia, to help develop clean energy for coastal cities and coastal environments. The majority of the world big cities are on the coast, and there's a good opportunity here to provide clean energy through offshore wind. To give you an idea, a general idea here, within 50 miles of the US coast, there's enough offshore wind capacity to power the country twice, two times over. In the Gulf of Maine, there's 156 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, and it takes less than 5 gigawatts to power the state of Maine. That's how much offshore wind capacity that we have. The big issue in Maine is that we have deep waters off of our coast. In Europe, the first offshore wind farm was erected close to 30 years ago. There's over 5,500 turbines in Europe, but they're all fixed to the seabed because they build them in shallow waters. Maine has deep waters, and anytime you're over 150 feet of water, you can't cost effectively fix the turbines to the seabed. You have to float them. And back in almost 12 years ago, we developed the first floating offshore wind research team in the country at the University of Maine. I'll tell you more about that later. But in the meantime, south of us, there's been a revolution going on in offshore wind. There's, as you see right south of us, the states have developed very, very ambitious plans for offshore wind. Massachusetts, for example, has 5,600 megawatt planned. To put that in perspective, if you recall, Maine Yankee in Maine, the nuclear power plant was 800 megawatts. So Massachusetts essentially wants to build the equivalent of 7 Maine Yankees worth of offshore wind, and they're already on their way. They put out just over the last few days a 1,600 megawatt solicitation. They've approved 2 projects, each at 800 megawatts already, but they're all fixed to the seabed because they have shallower waters. New York has a 9,000 megawatt plan. Rhode Island 430, Connecticut 2,000, New Jersey 7,500, Maryland almost 1,500 megawatts, Virginia over 5,000 megawatts. So there's a revolution going on. President Biden last month announced a plan of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That's more than 30 That's more than 30 Maine Yankees. Okay, that's what we're talking about. More than 30 nuclear power plants worth of wind, offshore wind, between now and 2030, which will attract $100 billion of investment and 44,000 jobs. So in Maine, we have deep waters, so we've been focusing on floating wind. We're focusing on leading the country in the floating wind space. So this is a map of the US showing where waters is deep and what it requires floating turbines. The dark blue areas require floating turbines because the water is too deep. The light blue areas near the coast can have fixed bottom turbines because they have shallower waters. If you look at the Gulf of Maine, it's all dark blue. So the only option for Maine to have offshore wind is to actually do floating turbines. Now, south of us in Massachusetts, they have very light blue areas here. So the projects off Massachusetts coast I've talked about are all fixed bottom in shallower waters. However, Massachusetts is going to saturate those areas, going to go beyond that to floating at some point in time. If you look at the West Coast, it's all dark blue. California has major plans for floating offshore wind right now because that's the only option they have. Now, around the world, there's a race to develop floating offshore wind technologies, and offshore wind is anticipated to become more than $1 trillion industry over the next 2 decades. So let's go back to Maine a little bit. We started working on offshore wind when gasoline prices, heating oil prices in Maine went up to $4 a gallon back in the late the first decade here of this millennium. And Maine essentially spends close to $3.6 to $5.8 billion per year on fossil fuels. That's heating oil, that's gasoline, that's natural gas. Most of this money leaves the state of Maine because we don't have those resources in Maine. So we're shipping away every year close to $4 billion, $4 to $5 billion a year, and that leaves the state of Maine. Think about if we can keep some of those dollars in Maine and put them to good use by developing our own renewable energy resources. What we found is offshore wind is the biggest opportunity that the state of Maine has. Not only the only opportunity, but the biggest opportunity. If what we calculated that if we harnessed only 3% of the Gulf of Maine area, just 3% within 50 miles of the Gulf of Maine, we can heat every home and drive every car. So the question really is, where do we pick that 3% so we can electrify heating and transportation in our state? How do we float wind turbines? There are 3 major categories of floating wind turbines, and the designs are all borrowed from the oil and gas industry. So we've taken oil and gas rigs, which have been built for decades, floating rigs, and figured out how to turn them into floating wind turbines. So the first family of designs is called the spar. The second is a semi-submersible, and the third is a tension leg platform. The spar design is a very long tube that has a mass at the bottom. It's full of air, essentially. Think about a tube that's 300 feet long, 25 feet in diameter, and has a big mass near the bottom to keep it straight up. Think of it as if you took a water bottle, emptied it of water, put a bunch of sand at the bottom, and put it in your bathtub. It will stand vertically up. And the more sand you put in, the more actually it will ballast it down. But that's essentially what a spar is, except a lot bigger. Now notice that the spar has 3 mooring lines on it because you have to keep it on station. And that's what the 3 mooring lines do. And they're mooring lines just like you would have on a boat. They're typically made out of steel chain, even though we're looking at synthetic mooring lines as well right now. The second family of designs is called semi-submersibles. The advantage there is they're a lot shallower, they have a much shallower draft, so you can actually make them dockside and tow them out to sea. These designs will have about 25 to 30 foot draft. And that's the design we're actually focusing on in the state of Maine, and would like to make it out of concrete because Maine has the ability to produce concrete locally. And concrete will stand up better in the environment than steel offshore. And we can actually get over 100-year life on a hull versus 20 to 30 years on a steel hull. So that would reduce the environmental footprint of construction. The semi-submersible works like a boat. Essentially, if you've sailed a catamaran has 2 hulls. And the way the catamaran stays stable is by having the hulls apart and by having bigger hulls. So in our case, this design is the trimaran. It's got 1, 2, and 3 hulls. And these 3 hulls keep it stable. And basically, they're made out of concrete in our case, and they're filled with air. They're like 3 big concrete air tubes, air cans. And the tower is sitting in the center. The last design is called a tension leg platform. What it is, it's got a big buoyancy module, like a big air buoy here. And that buoy wants to pop out of the water. And you keep it from popping out of the water by putting tension legs to the seabed. The disadvantage of that is you need very expensive moorings. And the unit is not stable on its own. You have to actually hold it up as you take it from port to its final location. Whereas both the semi and the spar can be towed out to sea on their own. I'll show you that in a minute. There's essentially a gold rush right now to build floating turbines, to design and build floating turbines across the world. There's over 40 designs out there, and they're all competing for a position in this growing industry. There are countries competing with other countries to get floating turbines out there first right now. And in the United States, the University of Maine and the state of Maine are likely to build the very first commercial scale floating turbine and lead the country in that direction. We started our program.
Wow.
We started our program about a decade ago, but back in May 2013, Maine made history, and UMaine made history because we built and deployed the first grid-connected offshore wind turbine in the United States. People don't know that, but we did. We built the first one. So in May 2013, we put this unit in the water. It was made at UMaine in our lab, taken on 3 trucks to Brewer, Maine, assembled in Brewer, Maine by Chimbro, put in the Penobscot River and towed out to sea. And this is how we towed it down the Penobscot River. You could see here we have 3 flotation columns, 1, 2, and 3 in each corner. That's how it works like a trimaran. And this is a 1:8 scale version of the bigger unit. So that's how we towed it out to sea. And then we got it to Castine and moored it to the seabed. When we got to Castine, we had already pre-installed 3 mooring anchors, 3 mooring lines, and tied it to each corner of the hull. And we had a pre-installed undersea cable that brought the power back to shore. We hooked that up, and we ran that for a year and a half. And because it's a 1:8 scale, it saw very extreme environments in a very short time relative to its size. And we had over 50 sensors on board. And the purpose of that was to figure out if we can design a hull that will last 500 years in the Gulf of Maine. And the good news is we've proven that we can. And this is an example of one of the first storms we encountered in December 2013. It was called Winter Storm Electra. So what you see blowing across here is actually snow. This is a snowstorm blowing across. And you can see the size of the waves and the white caps relative to the size of the hull. Remember, this is a 1:8 scale version of the bigger unit. And relative to the size of the hull, these were 60-foot waves relative to the size. Notice the white caps, and notice that the hull isn't even moving. You can't even see it move in a 50-year storm. And that was the aha moment, that our designs work, our computer models work. And because of that, the US Department of Energy decided to invest in us $50 million to build the bigger one. So we won a national competition to build the bigger one. Just to give you a sense of what happened, during that year and a half deployment off Castine, that unit saw 50 to 500-year storms, about 40 storms like that. And the maximum nacelle acceleration was less than 2/10 of a G. And then the maximum heel angle was 7 degrees. So the tower moved off vertical only 7 degrees in a 500-year storms. And what you see in blue and red are our computer models versus the actual measurements of the motions of the hull. Essentially, we know how to predict the motions of these hulls in these 500-year nor'easters. So the next step now of the project is to build the bigger one. So we're going to build one unit, just one hull. But it's not just one hull, it's an 11 megawatt unit. It'll be the biggest floating turbine in the world. And the units will have, each blade in that unit will be the size of a football field. So it's a big unit. And that unit will be capable of providing enough electricity for close to 5,000 to 6,000 Maine homes, Maine households. UMaine has over 60 patents to date on this technology. And it was designed so we can fabricate it here in Maine. Our goal is to start construction next year and to have it off Monhegan Island to be tested starting in 2023, end of 23, beginning of 24. The good news is the National Renewable Energy Lab did a study which they published last year, and that showed that this technology, the UMain's technology, when scaled up to full-scale farms, when we're cranking these things up, we can get down to below 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's a very competitive energy resource. Because of all of that, we were joined by two major corporations that are invested in the technology. Each has invested $50 million, committed to invest $50 million. One company is called RWE, and the other one is the Mitsubishi Corporation through its subsidiary in the US called the Diamond Generating Corporation and Diamond Offshore Wind. These two companies are some of the best in the world in their field. RWE is the second largest offshore wind developer in the world. They're a German company. And both of them are investing in Maine to help us build this hull. Notice the hull has 3 mooring lines. I'll describe a bit how it works. We have 3 mooring lines, 1, 2, and 3. It floats in the water, just like a boat would float. Instead of having 1 hull or 2 hulls, it has 3 hulls, 1 on each corner, 1, 2, and 3. Under the water, the 3 hulls are tied together by rectangular beams. The whole hull is made out of concrete. You might ask, well, how can concrete float? Well, it's not concrete that floats. This is essentially a big concrete air can. So each one of these flotation columns on each corner are about 120 feet long, about 40 feet wide, and they're full of air. It's basically a big concrete air cans. And then the center column is also another concrete air can. And under the water, they're tied together with concrete rectangular air cans as well. Now, the hull is very unique, and I'll describe it in just a short while. Its design is unique, but the project is off Monhegan Island, about 2 miles south of Monhegan. And that's what the site looks like. It's got 300 feet of water. That's Monhegan Island. You can see in red Monhegan Island up here where it is in the state of Maine. And the area where the test area where we're going to go ahead and test it out is about 2 square miles. The state of Maine provided that test area to the University of Maine as a research site to do this kind of work back in 2010 through an act by the legislature. This is what's unique about our technology is that we can make it locally. And it can be built like a bridge, like a concrete bridge. If you've seen a segmental concrete bridge being built, essentially this is how we're going to build this. So rather than try to develop a technology and figure out how to industrialize it later, we started with an industrialized concrete construction method for bridges and applied it to a hull. So we have an industrialized technology right off the bat. So to give more examples here is, this is on the left-hand side is like 3 roadways coming together over the water. You get 1 and 2 and 3 roadways, and they're supported by piers, 4 piers. Now, in this case, the piers are made out of concrete cans that are hollow. They're cast near the bridge site and stacked on top of one another with an epoxy in between and squeezed together. Each one of these cans could be 30 to 40 feet in diameter and 15 feet high. And then you squeeze them together vertically with like long bolts that are called post-tensioning tendons to make one big unit. And then the superstructure of the bridge, the roadway itself, is made with rectangular boxes that are filled with air as well. And they're made near the site, put up there and squeezed together. Now, if you take that bridge and flip it upside down, you've got our hull. So the idea here is to turn bridge builders into hull builders and be able to make it right here in Maine. So the only difference is a lot easier to build this than to build a bridge, because you're starting on the ground and build it from the ground up, then put the whole hull in the water and tow it out to sea. This is an example of the Sarah Long Bridge that was built by Chimbrow between Maine and New Hampshire. And this is when it was being built a few years ago. And notice here the concrete boxes. These concrete boxes were made right at the site. Many of them, half of them were made near the site, and half of them were brought in. And they were brought in on a barge and lifted with a crane and stacked on top of one another like big, huge Legos. And between each layer, between each can, there's essentially an epoxy. And then there's steel post-tensioning tendons, like big bolts, if you wish, that are squeezed vertically to tie the whole thing together. That's how strong these are when you make bridges out of them. But think about using the same technology to build hulls. That's the invention that Maine has developed. Now, the goal here is to try to make some of these in brewer, these boxes and cans in brewer, or make them in Searsport. And we're also looking potentially at Eastport as one of the facilities to assemble them. In Searsport, the goal is to assemble the hull and tow it out to sea. Now, how do we moor it to the seabed? We can moor it with steel chains or with synthetic mooring lines. But at the very end, there's an anchor into the seabed. We're likely to be using what we call a drag anchor. This is what it looks like. It looks like a big plow, essentially. And you tow it along the mud with a tugboat. And as you tow it along the mud, it embeds itself into the mud and sets itself in. It could be embedded 40 feet or so until you have enough tension on the tugboat to hold up the turbine. So you test it out to the tension that you need. And then you hook it up to the turbine. Each turbine will have 3 mooring lines like that on it. Over the last decade, the University of Maine has been busy collecting data on the environment in the test site off Monhegan Island. We had bird biologists and fish biologists and marine mammal biologists study who lives under the water, above the water. We've taken tags and put them on marine mammals to see where they move around, how they move around. We've had the New Jersey Audubon worked with us and put a radar on Monhegan Island and scanned the skies for over a year to look for birds and bats and identify how they fly and where they fly. We also had bird biologists go out there and count the birds and the types of birds that would fly over the test site. So this was the most studied test site from an environmental perspective in the Gulf of Maine that we know of. After all this data has been collected, now we're going to take a single hull, put it off Monhegan Island, and see how that impacts its environment. We're going to see how the birds' behavior changes. We're going to learn over 5 years afterwards how the fish behavior may change, what the impact might be on the lobster industry. So these are the kinds of studies we're going to be doing under that one turbine, so we can develop the scientific and engineering basis for going the next step. And to show you the kind of numerical tools we use to design these hulls and how we design these hulls, we used computer models developed at the University of Maine or advanced at the University of Maine to figure out how the hull actually moves with the winds and the waves. And these numerical tools are visualized right here on the top. On the top, you see a 50-year storm, 50-year waves, 60 feet high, coming at the hull. And you can see how the hull moves under these waves. Now, this is exaggerated, so you can see it doesn't move that much. What you see below that are the stresses as the waves go through it. The stresses are color-coded to show us where the maximum stresses in the hull are to figure out how strong we have to make the hull. To give you a sense of what it takes to engineer a hull, we run over 80,000 simulations like this to represent different wind, wave, current environments, icing environments, snow environments, and so on and so forth, to make sure the hull is designed properly to survive 500 years out in the Gulf of Maine. How do the electric cables come to shore? Now, typically, if you have a big farm, and hopefully in the 2030s in Maine we'll have those, a big farm might have 50 turbines in it, about a mile apart. What you do is you put them in rows of, say, 10 turbines or so, and each row would have, each turbine would have a cable coming out of it, but each row would have one collection point. And then each row of 10 turbines, then each collection point from each row comes together to a collection point offshore, and you have one cable coming back to shore. Now you try to bury the cable into the seabed to the extent that you can. Now, from each turbine, the cable comes down through what we call a J-tube, and it goes and it makes a lazy wave and back into the seabed. It's tied to the seabed with a tether or an anchor, and then we try to bury the export cable. For the Monhegan line, we have about a 24-mile export cable for the Monhegan projects, which we plan to bury to the extent that we can. Notice what the cables look like. There's a lot of questions that we got asked. Well, would these cables kill the fish, and would they have EMFs on them and so on and so forth. Well, the good news is we've been using these kinds of cables in the Gulf of Maine for decades now. Give you an example. How do we power the islands off the coast of Maine? Actually, we run cables from the mainland to the islands, many islands, to power them. And these are similar to the cables we'll be using. For example, in Islesboro, Islesboro has had a subsea cable connecting it to Northport since 1995, for over 60 years. And the cable was replaced in 2015. It's a 4-inch diameter cable, and it's buried about 6 feet in the mud. Now, our cable will be a bit bigger. It'll be 6 to 8 inches in diameter. You can see it here on the right-hand side. And our goal is to also bury it in the mud to the extent that we can. As you know, in the Gulf of Maine, the seabed has rock outcrops that might prevent us from burying it in certain locations. Now, how do we know how to run the cable and where to run it and how to bury it? You do offshore surveys. So on the right-hand side is our proposed cable route from the Monhegan Island test site to Booth Bay Harbor. We plan to take the cable to Booth Bay. And the question is how can we find mud pockets to do it? Now, we've done some studies to figure out where we think the mud pockets are. Then we send ships out there that send seismic waves to the seabed and help us figure out where the mud pockets are. And on the left-hand side is the cable from Islesboro to Northport that's been around for decades. Our cable on the right-hand side and the cable on the left-hand side are essentially the same. They're both going to be buried the same. Neither the left cable nor the right cable is going to have any bigger impact on the fish or the wildlife. People fish over that cable right now off Islesboro and have been for decades. Now, how do we know again if we can bury the cable? As I said, we did a fishing survey. We did a survey. We ran boats, specialized vessels that send seismic waves and other types of waves to the seabed to figure out what the seabed looks like. And we did that last month in April. And we're analyzing this data as we speak, so real time. This is just a snapshot of the data we've collected to give you a sense of the resolution of the data. What you see in brown and yellow and green are outcrops where you have rocks. What you see in purple are essentially deposits of sand and mud. And initially, we planned to have the survey along the line that's dotted. And after we've started running, we've run the survey, we're going to try to move the line to the green location, if you wish, where there are mud pockets, so we can bury the cable 6 feet and allow most fishing to take place normally there. What does the mooring line look like, and how big is it, and is it going to impact the whales? Well, here's what it looks like actually to scale next to a 6-foot person. There are 2 types of mooring lines that we're looking at. One of them is a steel chain mooring line, and that's one chain in the link, one link in the chain, if you wish. And on the left-hand side here in the middle, you have an 8-inch diameter synthetic mooring line. It's a polyester type cable or some other synthetic mooring lines. Notice that these are big units. So these are very big, and they're tensioned to hold up the hull. And therefore, they're not going to move around. You're not going to have a whale or a marine mammal getting tangled up in that. It's not like a very small fishing line and so forth. So there's a lot of tension in it. It's very big. And experience has shown us over decades in the oil and gas industry who's used these kinds of mooring systems that the marine mammals and the whales go around them. They don't run into them. We have videos of whales going around these in the oil and gas industry. Now, this has been a long history in the state of Maine. This has not just happened overnight. I've been at it for 12 years, and I'm the old person in the room right now in offshore wind in Maine. But back in 2008, the governor, Governor Baldacci at the time, put together an ocean energy task force with which I served on with Angus King and many others. It was a bipartisan task force. They put a report together that recommended 5 gigawatts of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine to electrify heating and transportation. It was not easy to explain to people 10 years ago that we'll have electric cars, but we have them today. It's easy to explain today that we could have electric cars, and they do work. In 2009, the state of Maine passed a bill unanimously, 1465 in the legislature. Imagine unanimously, with one abstention, to provide, to assign the test site for the University of Maine to do research. Following that, in 2010, Maine voters actually voted to provide the university $11 million to get going and design some technologies and do the demonstration project. So we are under a mandate, unanimous mandate by the legislature, and a vote by the people of Maine to do this. So we're doing what the people of Maine have asked us to do for the last 10 years. Today, Governor, in this last couple of years, Governor Mills have put some ambitious targets to achieve state carbon neutrality by 2045. To do that, we need offshore wind. We also need other forms of renewable energy to work together, but offshore wind is key to get there. So what's the state of Maine plan? The state of Maine is developing an offshore wind plan right now by working with constituents across the state and all users of the sea. And the plan calls for crawl before you walk, walk before you run, do it right. Back in 2013, I told you we did a 1-to-8 scale. That was crawling. In 2023, we hope to put a full-scale 11 megawatt unit. That's walking slowly. In 2025, the state of Maine is proposing a turbine called a research array of up to 12 turbines, about a mile apart each, to further scale up the technology. You need that. You can't go from a single turbine to an industry. You gotta have a step in the middle, or we can potentially make some major mistakes. So the 2025 project, the research array, actually there's a bill in there today that's being heard by the legislature as we speak today. So if you're interested in this, email the EUT committee to vote on this bill. I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm just subliminally telling you you can't do that. And then the idea is these turbines, this research array would be over between 20 and 30 miles offshore, and would be in an area that would minimize impact on the environment and minimize impacts on fishing and so on and so forth. And one goal of the research array is to work with fishermen to figure out how to fish inside that farm as well. So this is what the research array may look like. Notice the turbines, they're about a mile apart in groups of 4. And between them, we're going to leave large areas so vessels can easily go through them. That's one potential opportunity. It'll be 16 square miles. It'll have 12 turbines. And notice that one of our goals is to be able to see how to fish inside the farm as well. The circles that you see in white are the areas where it would be difficult to fish because of the mooring lines and anchors, but you can still fish right inside the farm where my cursor is. And that's what we're going to be studying, is how to do that. Working with, that's part of the research that the research array will be doing. The other opportunity I'd like to talk about is the opportunity beyond offshore wind. As we build an industry like that and potentially bring billions of dollars to the state of Maine, we're also going to impact other industries. One industry we're going to impact is our boat building industry. There's an opportunity to build fleets of vessels to build these offshore wind farms and to maintain them. This is a 3D printed boat that we printed in our lab, the first of its kind in the world, which we won a Guinness World Record for. It was a 25-foot, 5,000-pound vessel that we printed in 3 days. But this particular vessel is a potential for us to actually, in the future, to be potentially printing some of these boats. We are actually studying right now an opportunity to print, to build a 60 to 70-foot vessel. It's called a crew transfer vessel, to go out to the Monhegan project and maintain it. And that vessel will be built in Maine, and we're hoping to 3D print the mold that will be used to fabricate a composite vessel. So to summarize here for us, we've been on a journey over the last 12 years. The next part of that journey is to build a single turbine off Monhegan Island. Our goal is to help decarbonize the state of Maine and create thousands of clean energy jobs in the state, keep our energy dollars in Maine, and keep our youth in Maine. At the University of Maine Advanced Structures and Composites Center, we have now close to 20 engineers working only floating offshore wind. Many of them came back to Maine. There were Mainers that left Maine and heard about our project, wanted to come back to Maine to be part of this future and help create this future. Many of them are in the lab today. Some of them testified to the legislature today about why they came back to Maine. So we hope to bring a lot more people back to Maine, young people, to build this next generation industry, electrify heating and transportation in the state. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take some questions.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Dagher. And we also have, as I mentioned earlier, we have Representative Genevieve McDonald here to answer questions as well. If you are interested in posing a question, please go to the chat function on the bottom of your screen and just click on that, type in your question and hit enter. And we have a few questions now, and let me get to those. Question is there any practical application for integrating a submerged turbine suspended below the floating platform? For example, to have two power generating devices on the same platform?
Very good question, actually. Thanks for asking that. We've looked at that, actually. We've looked at to see if we can locate wave energy devices and tidal energy devices or current energy devices on this. You can, but it's not quite clear that it's cost effective. I think the more energy generation devices you have, the more complex the system is, the more O&M you have to do. But it's certainly worthwhile studying further. It's on our radar screen. Thanks for asking the question.
Very good. Question, and you've addressed this a little bit, but could you elaborate a little bit more on the concerns of some in the fishing industry about this project, specifically the research array? Could you talk about not only what those concerns are, but also explain more about what the university is working on to help the fishing industry navigate in and around the research array?
Sure, I'll take a first crack at it, and I'll hand it over to Genevieve, because Genevieve lives and breathes the fishing industry. So Representative Genevieve McDonald, and I had a great pleasure to work with her, and she's brought a lot of the concerns from the fishing industry to us. So at a high level, just to give you a sense, remember I said if we harness just 3% of the area of the Gulf of Maine, we can heat every home in Maine and drive every car. 3%. And that's 3% within 50 miles of the coast. So the question is, in a worst case scenario, we need 3%. I'm not suggesting that we do have 3%, but the worst case scenario, we need 3%. And the question really is which 3% of the area within 50 miles minimizes impacts on the fisheries? That's what we're trying to figure out. And in the long run, that's the goal. So as you might imagine, 97% of the Gulf of Maine within 50 miles would be completely open to the fisheries, even if we go ahead and did 3%. and so that, as you know, would have a minimal impact on the industry. The other thing we're trying to do is figure out how to fish inside one of these farms as well. We're trying to study that by having the right people in the room, by working with the fishing industry and figure out within that 3%, if you wish, how to go fish inside of it. So the purpose of the research array is to answer those questions. Actually build an array and work with the fishing industry, actually work to go out there and figure out how to fish inside the farm, figure out what the challenges may or may not be. And we're confident that we could find solutions to fishing even within that 3% that this industry can potentially take. I'm going to hand it back to Genevieve.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Dagher, and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to see everyone. So I'm happy to discuss the concerns of the fishing industry, and there are really two primary concerns. One is environmental concerns. What impact will the research array, will wind development in the Gulf of Maine have on the marine ecosystem? And the other is displacement. Fishermen are concerned about losing fishing bottom. This is a heritage industry, and fishermen are generally resistant to change. So to the environmental impacts, there is a NEPA process, there is an environmental review and assessment that is part of the permitting process. And so I think a lot of those questions will get answered as this process moves along, both for Monhegan and for the research array. And then to speak to displacement, the fishing industry is really concerned about the development that we've seen in Southern New England and in the Mid-Atlantic. These are really big commercial scale leases, and they have displaced fishermen in those areas. And so I would say that the scale that Maine is working at, to start with a single turbine and test the feasibility, how close can fishermen feasibly operate, and then expanding that to a 12 turbine research array, still taking in those considerations into conversations, into dialogue, into stakeholder engagement, and really seeing how we can coexist is the right path forward.
Thank you, Representative McDonald. Thank you for your leadership in the legislature on this issue as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go back and listen to the rest of that hearing when
Yeah,
we finish here.
Yeah, I need to get back and give my testimony too.
Oh,
Right. I'll run through these other questions then too. Question about the choice of the Monhegan site. What led you to choose that site, and what role will the Monhegan site play in the development of the research array?
Thank you. Excellent question. The Monhegan site was selected in the state through a process that was put together by the state of Maine, where they've looked at over 10 different sites in state waters where we can do research testing. They've talked to fishermen, they've talked to local fishing communities and environmental interests, and had dozens of meetings along the coast to figure out where we can do a demonstration project. And the state then identified Monhegan as an area that they assigned to the University of Maine to do this work. But it took a long process to figure out where we can do a test. That's Monhegan. The next part of the question is, what do we learn from Monhegan and then to take to the research array? The Monhegan is a single project, single turbine project. And its impact is based on a single turbine. We're going to learn a lot about how this unit can be built, single turbine can be built. We're going to learn its impact on the environment around it. We're going to learn how to fish around the single unit. But that's not going to tell us how to build an industry, how to build a farm. So the research, what we learned in Monhegan is going to be taken to the research array. And in the research array, we'll learn how to build more than one, how to scale up manufacturing, how to industrialize manufacturing, which port facilities can we use in Maine, what upgrades do we need to have to our port facilities, how do we store them, how do we deploy them, how do we maintain these turbines? And then more important than not, what is the impact on the environment and the fisheries? So what we learned in Monhegan, we're going to go out and apply on an array and say, okay, we figured out how to fish around one turbine. How do we figure out how to fish around 12 turbines? Okay, and how do we space them apart? And what kind of mooring lines do we use? We're looking at both synthetic mooring lines as well as chain mooring lines. The synthetics actually have a smaller footprint on the seabed. Could we use those and reduce the impact on the fisheries? So those are some of the things would be learning. And you know, building an industry like this is like running a big marathon. And you don't just go out there in the morning and decide to run 26 miles. Okay, and what we're trying to do here is crawl before we walk, walk before we run the marathon. And we've been crawling, we've been walking slowly, and the research array is part of walking diligently before we go out and build anything bigger in the Gulf of Maine. So it's a right approach that the state's taking. Certainly, I applaud the state for moving in that direction and being so open and holding all these meetings to locate the research array. So does that answer the question?
I believe so. Another question was asking about, it says, why would you not get the data from this project before moving on to the research array of 12 turbines?
That's essentially going to happen. If you look at how long it'll take to get to the 12 turbine array, these processes can take 5 to 6, 7, or 8 years before a farm comes to fruition. So essentially, we're just at the very beginning of a long process to get to the research array. So if all goes well, we should start construction of this first unit next year. And we'll learn a lot about what it takes to build it starting next year and the year after. We're already learning a lot of what it takes to where we can build them. And that information is going to be fed into the research array process. Similarly, if this unit gets into the, if this unit is in the water at the end of 23, beginning 24, we're going to learn a lot of what it takes to take it out there, how to fish around it, and so on and so forth, which will help plan, if you wish, what we do with the research array. So the timing is actually perfect to get the Monhegan project done and then start planning a 5 to 7 or 8 year process for the research array today. So we're at the very beginning of a long road with the research array.
Very good. We have a question that asks about any resistance expressed so far by the public for the effect on beach views by placing these wind turbines offshore in Maine.
Very, very good question. And the beauty of floating offshore wind is that you can place them farther out because they float. You don't have to have them fixed to the seabed. That gives us an opportunity to pick sites that provide a minimized impact on view sheds. We've done a lot of studies at the University of Maine to look at view sheds from different beach areas. as well as from the tops of mountains in Maine. And based on that, the state of Maine is going to help to identify where to put these farms. To give you a sense, if you're about 25 miles offshore, and you're standing, if the farm is 25 miles offshore, you're standing on the beach, you're not going to see pretty much anything from the beach. The hub of the turbine would be below the horizon, and you'd be too far for your eye to even see the blade maybe come across the horizon on the top. If you're at 30 miles offshore, you're basically not going to see even the tips of the blades, based, of course, on what the size of the rotor is. So the beauty of floating is that you can put them farther out to sea. If you had the Queen Elizabeth parked in Portland, moored in Portland, you're going to see a big Queen Elizabeth. As the Queen Elizabeth sails to the ocean, it's eventually going to fall off the horizon. You're not going to see it anymore. And floating turbines are the same way. By getting them far enough away from us, we're not going to see them anymore. And that's an advantage compared to what they're doing in New Jersey and in Massachusetts and so forth. So,
Thank you.
does that answer the question?
I believe so. It did for me. Another question deals with the commercialization of the patents. How will the university and/or the state capitalize on the commercialization of the patents in particular? And will the patents be licensed to private companies? And another part of that question is, are your patents completely owned by the university or by some of your partner companies?
The answer is we have over 50, I should say over 60 patents as of today, and they're all owned by the university. And they will be licensed to developers, and then you may derive a revenue back from these developments. So, and that process has been going on for a long time. Jake Ward, the Vice President for Economic Development and Innovation at the University of Maine, has led this effort and done a tremendous job at laying down, if you wish, contractual vehicles to allow us to allow the state of Maine and the University of Maine to benefit from these patents.
Thank you. What is the expected life of the rotating parts of the wind turbine? Considering the long expected life or the expected long life of the float itself, how will this design impact the repair and replace or upgrade of the wind turbine itself?
Excellent question. Typical offshore wind farms in Europe that were built 30 years ago, they were designed initially for 20 years of life, and after which they would basically repower them. Now, our hull, we've designed our hull for close to 100 years of life because it's made out of concrete, and we've designed it in such a way to do that. So the opportunity here, every 20 to 30 years, to go back and tow the hull back to shore and put a new turbine on, tow it back out. So the opportunity here, by doing so, we reduce the costs for the next generation deployments and reduce the environmental impact of this technology on the world around it. So we're very excited about the opportunity to do it that way. And we're the first to actually propose offshore wind hulls, floating hulls, that would last 100 years, so that we can repower them every 25 years. So our children and grandchildren would be repowering these just like the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was built by UMaine alumni, actually. Francis Groves, UMaine alumni, was in charge of the Hoover Dam. And the Hoover Dam has been around because it's a big chunk of concrete in the water, essentially. And the only thing we replace are the moving parts. And think of this as a Hoover Dam as well, where we would replace the moving part every 20 to 30 years. That answers the question.
Yes, thank you. How are the possible assembly sites that you mentioned, such as Searsport, Eastport, Brewer, how are they being assessed, and what is the timeline for those decisions?
We're looking at a lot of different things. One is how to build the first one. Then the next question is, how do you build 12 of them? And then how do you build 50 of them in the future? And all of those are different questions. The state of Maine has actually hired a private company, Moffitt and Nichols, whose expertise is in port facilities, to actually look at that question. And this company is worked with us and others on how to identify port facilities. The partners we have at RWE and the Mitsubishi Diamond Corporation are also looking at that for the single unit, for 12 units, and for more. So it's a teamwork effort to figure out what these facilities do. And the prime suspects, of course, are Searsport right now, and Eastport is an opportunity because of the deep draft at Eastport, and there's fabrication sites across the state of Maine that could be used to actually assemble these hulls. So so there's the process over the next many years will help identify and answer fully these questions.
Thank you. Question about the concrete sections, and could you explain a little bit more how you can create them in a way that retains the air? Do you add air? I mean, are they pressurized? Could you explain a little bit more for those of us who are not engineers?
Okay, let's take a wine barrel, okay, or a beer keg, you know, and empty it out and toss it in the water. It's going to float, right? If it's sealed, and think of these flotation columns that we have are essentially a beer keg made out of concrete instead of being, you know, 3 feet and so forth. It's 120 feet long and so forth. So basically, it's a skin of concrete that contains air in it. We don't fill it with air. When you cast the concrete, the air just comes into it, and we seal the top. So,
in the thickness of the walls of the concrete sections?
yeah, they vary from a minimum of a foot and they could be to 1.5 feet in some places. So,
very good.
And in some places they reach actually 2 feet near the bottom of the hull. So,
yeah. And this will probably be our final question because both you and Representative McDonald have to get back to the hearing. But the question is, who is expected to buy power from the first, from the Monhegan turbine once it's ready?
Well, it's going to actually be fed into the CMP grid right now, and the goal is to have it fed through in the Booth Bay area. So basically, people who get their power from CMP would get the power from that project. So.
Very good. Well, Dr. Dagher and Representative McDonald, thank you both so much for your presentation today. This was wonderful. And as I mentioned, folks, we will be posting this on the University of Maine Alumni Association website, but we'll also be sending everybody who registered for today's webinar a link to that website so that you can watch it again, so you can share it with others. And we do encourage you to pay attention to what's going on now, both in Augusta with the hearings on this legislation and on other topics related to the remarkable work being done at the university through Dr. Dagher's center and among his colleagues. So again, on behalf of the Alumni Association, we thank you, Dr. Dagher and Representative McDonald. And for all of you who are able to join us, thank you so much for your time. Take care and enjoy the rest of your week.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Go Black Bears.